It was February 1964. A rower on the Thames looked down into the grey water near Hammersmith Bridge and saw something that did not belong. At first he thought, wrongly, that it was a mannequin, a coat, a prank. Then a policeman and a coroner and a town in shock realised it was a woman. Naked, bloated from the cold river, a piece of clothing shoved into her mouth. Her name was Hannah Tailford. She was 30. She had worked on the streets, and she would not be the last. Hello, I'm Dr. Eleanor Marsh. This is Still Unanswered. Tonight, the Hammersmith Nude murders, what the papers called Jack the Stripper. The cluster of killings across West London in 1964 and 1965 that claimed at least 6 women and left a city with no answer, only questions. I'm joined by Leah O'Donnell. Leah works with Frontline Outreach for sex worker rights here in London. Leah, thanks for coming on. I know this material is hard.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's heavy, but it matters. Thanks for having me. I've worked with people whose lives echo these stories, and yeah, we owe them better than the headlines did. I've worked with people whose lives echo these stories, and yeah, we owe them better than the headlines did.
By the way, before we go further, trigger warning. We will be discussing violence against women, murder, and police mishandling. If that's hard for you, take care. Leah, can you hear that river? That smell? People in the 1960s thought of the Thames as a dumping ground sometimes. It becomes almost symbolic in this story.
Yeah, the Thames keeps secrets. You can imagine the cold, the damp, and the women, many of them, pushed into those places because of poverty, displacement, illness, or else trafficking. They aren't just background scenery.
Exactly. So tonight we're going to tell the story of those women: Hannah Tailford, Elizabeth Figg, Irene Lockwood, Helen Barthélemy, Mary Fleming, Frances Brown, Bridget O'Hara, and the police campaign that followed. We'll look at the clues: paint flecks, missing teeth, the ligatures. We'll talk suspects, from false confessions to the troubling possibility of police involvement, and we'll end by asking why this case still haunts us.
And I want to push us to think about language. The press called them nude prostitutes. That phrase removes their names, their dignity. We'll keep naming them. We'll talk about their lives.
Good. Let's start with context. West London in the early 1960s. The city was changing. Post-war trauma reaching modern leisure and a booming nightlife. And under that, a large street and indoor sex economy, mostly criminalised, often policed harshly. Leah, tell listeners what it looked like on the ground.
Right. Picture Notting Hill before it became the pricier place it is now. Lots of tenements, rooming houses, derelict lots by the Thames. Women worked the streets, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. They had clients who arrived in cars and a rhythm of pickups around pubs and railway bridges. There was almost no safety net. If you were ill or pregnant or being evicted, it pushed you into riskier choices. Police often saw them as offenders rather than people needing protection.
And policing in the 1960s, this is pre-DNA, pre-scene preservation. Scotland Yard had forensics, but nowhere near modern standards. Evidence could get lost, contamination was common. That matters here because later forensic traces, paint flecks, fibres, were crucial, yet the records weren't handled with today's care.
Also, the reputation of the Met mattered. There were real corruption issues simmering then, and an adversarial relationship with vice areas. So when a sex worker disappeared, too often the reaction was, "Oh, she's a prostitute. She ran off. It's not a priority." That delay costs lives, and it costs evidence.
Which is exactly what happens at the start. Two earlier cases sit at the edge of the series and are sometimes omitted. Elizabeth Liz Figg, found in June 1959 at Duke's Meadows, and Gwyneth Rees in November 1963. Liz Figg was found with her clothes torn, underwear and shoes missing, strangulation marks on her neck, and her handbag gone. Gwyneth Rees was found on a rubbish tip with only a stocking. Strangulation, missing teeth, already the shadows of a pattern.
You notice that missing shoes, missing underwear, teeth removed in some cases, those are not random. They suggest the killer or killers had a specific way of treating the bodies, trophy taking, post-mortem mutilation. And when people are marginalised, sometimes those specific sexualised violences are underreported or described only with salacious headlines.
Then, 1964. Hannah Tailford is found in February near Hammersmith Bridge. By April, Irene Lookwood is found on the Corney Reach foreshore, pregnant, strangled with a fabric ligature. Helen Bartholomew is found in an alley in Brentford with tiny flecks of spray paint on her skin. July brings Mary Fleming, again paint flecks. October and November, Frances Brown gets into a client's car and later is found in a Kensington car park. And in early 1965, Bridget O'Hara's body is found near a storage shed behind the Heron Trading Estate in Acton with paint flecks that trace back to the estate.
If you hear that list and feel a pattern tightening, good. That's what police and later analysts saw. Strangulation, women who worked the streets, bodies dumped in public spaces, riverbanks, alleys, car parks, industrial paint on multiple bodies. That paint becomes one of the few objective threads.
Chief Superintendent John De Rose led what he called one of Scotland Yard's largest manhunts. He claimed to have interviewed roughly 7,000 suspects. Publicly, he used a tactic, announcing he'd narrowed suspects from 20 to 10 to 3, which he later admitted was a press strategy. After one of those press conferences, the killings stopped. That silence fuels some of the later theories. Did the killer die, get arrested for something else, or was he driven off?
And De Rose's tactic raises ethical flags. On one hand, public appeals can flush someone out. On the other, using press manipulation in a case involving marginalised victims can create a performance that substitutes for thorough work.
Let's slow down and humanise the women, because they've too often been stripped, pardon the word, down to the word nude. Elizabeth Figg, found in 1959 near Duke's Meadows, was known to use that area as a lover's lane. Hannah Tailford, again we said, was 30. Irene Lockwood was pregnant when she died. Frances Brown had connections to the Profumo affair as a witness at Stephen Ward's trial, a fact which later excited conspiracy writers looking for an establishment link. Bridget O'Hara's body led to the paint trail we should talk about. Leah, do you want to add anything about their lives?
Sure. Many of these women had been displaced, economic hardship, family breakdown, migration. Some were from Wales, Scotland, Ireland. They weren't simply prostitutes in a generic sense. They had relationships, histories, addictions, hopes. Irene's pregnancy. Think about that. Imagine the extra vulnerability, the choices she had to make. And Frances Brown's link to the Profumo scandal. Yes, the tabloids loved that angle, but it also made her a nexus where politics, sex, and class intersected. The media used those intersections to sensationalize rather than to sensationalize.
I want to pause and talk about that paint. Paint flecks sound like a small, almost trivial clue, but they mattered. In Helen Barthélemy, Mary Fleming, and Bridget O'Hara, forensic analysts found tiny flecks of industrial or automotive spray paint. Investigators traced some of it to a transformer area adjacent to a paint spraying shop on the Heron trading estate. That was the first time in the case we had a geographic fix on somewhere the killer likely worked or had access to.
That's the kind of forensic link that, if handled right, could be decisive. You follow the flecks to a site, you check who's employed there, whose clothes or vehicles could carry the paint. But remember, 1960s forensics weren't what they are now. Samples got mislaid, documentation was poor, and if investigators already had a bias, thinking these deaths were the result of transient trouble rather than targeted homicidal behavior, they might not have followed the paint with the urgency required.
Right, and that's where institutional failure creeps in. Another striking issue was evidence loss later on. Many forensic samples disappear or were destroyed. That slows or kills the chances of modern re-examination. People now talk about the killing stopping after DeRose's press moves and after a prime suspect, Mungo Ireland, a security guard at the Heron estate, died by suicide. Ireland's death note, interpreted by some as an admission or as despair, fed theory that the case was over because the killer was gone.
But watch how assumptions are made. Because the killing stopped, someone died, therefore closure. That's a seductive logic, but it often ignores possibilities. Maybe the killer moved. Maybe someone else committed a similar crime earlier. Maybe multiple offenders were at work. Also, when a suspect dies, we lose the chance to test them against modern techniques or to examine their alibi thoroughly.
And there were other suspects. Kenneth Archibald, a caretaker, walked in and confessed to Irene Lockwood's murder in April 1964. He later withdrew the confession and was acquitted. That's a reminder of false confessions and of how the police can latch on to someone to show progress. Then there's Freddie Mills, a former boxing champion whose nightclub connections led some journalists to name him in conspiracy theories. That theory is sensational and lacks forensic grounding, but it's part of the cultural noise. David Seabrook and others alleged an unnamed Metropolitan Police officer may have been implicated, stories that feed distrust of the institution.
And all of those theories, celebrity boxer, suicide by suspect, rogue cop, obscure what we should keep seeing: systemic neglect that made these women vulnerable. The emphasis on mythical suspects allows the media and the public to avoid confronting the everyday violence and policing failures that allowed these murders to happen in the first place.
Let's unpack two of the most serious suspects advanced by later researchers, Mungo Ireland on the one hand and Harold Jones on the other. DeRose hinted at Big John, widely understood as Ireland, who worked at the Heron estate, near where paint links were found. Ireland's suicide in 1967 and a note he left have been cited by DeRose and others as suggestive, but later research casts doubt. Some place Ireland in Scotland at times when an asserted killing occurred, complicating the timeline.
Then there's Harold Jones. This is chilling. Jones was convicted as a teenager for murdering two small girls in 1921 in Wales. Later research by Neil Milkins and the BBC's Dark Sun documentary mapped Jones to West London and found postcode overlaps with the dump sites. Jones's earlier crimes involved strangulation and a capacity for homicidal violence. The case for Jones is built on geographic profiling and behavioural parallels, not on DNA or a smoking gun.
The BBC documentary Dark Sun argued that Jones's movements and prior violent history make him a strong candidate, but critics say this is closure by narrative, a persuasive story made from fragments but not proof. The problem is we don't have DNA from the bodies to test Jones or Ireland, and many records are missing.
Which, again, points to institutional problems. People who died, witnesses, investigators, took knowledge with them, and files were misplaced. When evidence is gone, we end up with competing stories, where each tells us more about the teller than about the killer.
Let's take a breath and talk about the idea of a single killer versus multiple offenders. On the single killer side, a consistent victim type, similar geography, repeat signs like missing teeth and paint. On the other, variation across years, pre-series murders like Fig and Reese that might not fit perfectly, and the possibility of copycats. Leah, from your outreach work, does the idea of a single predator make sense in this environment?
It could. Predators often develop a hunting ground and a victim type. Sex workers who work alone at night are, tragically, a consistent target. But don't forget the context. There were a lot of men who had access to these spaces: drivers, security guards, labourers, police. And violent men sometimes act in clusters or repeat behaviour. The other thing, if multiple offenders are possible, it doesn't absolve police from failing to protect people. They still had to respond when a pattern emerged.
Good point. And looking at the more organised versus disorganised, the killer appears to have had access to a vehicle, evidence of being able to lure or transport victims, knowledge of industrial backlots. Yet the bodies were often left in exposed places. That mix suggests someone capable of planning, but also compelled to leave the bodies where they'd be found, whether out of contempt, a desire for attention, or poor impulse control.
Yes, and think about the underwear in Hannah Tailford's mouth. There's possibly a sexual sadism element there. But remember, 1960s coroner's reports and press accounts didn't always record sexual injuries the way modern reports do, so we have to be cautious. The rituals, missing teeth, underwear, are less about salacious detail and more about the offender's relationship to their victims: objectification, humiliation, perhaps trophy keeping.
Let's talk about policing again. Durose's manhunt was large, but it also relied on showmanship. He said he interviewed 7,000 men. He used the press to claim he had the killer within a shrinking list of suspects. That public relations approach may have helped calm an anxious public, but it also may have been a smokescreen for investigative limitations, and later allegations that a Met officer might have been implicated and quietly protected poison public confidence further.
There's a pattern across history. When victims are marginalised, investigations are less rigorous at first, and the public relations needs of police can outcompete careful, long-term inquiry. If someone within the force was suspected, the temptation, whether conscious or institutional, to protect a colleague can be enormous, especially in an era where internal accountability mechanisms were weaker.
People ask, would modern policing have solved this? The short answer, maybe. Modern DNA, better crime scene preservation, CCTV, and digital records increase chances. But even today, violence against sex workers is under-policed in many places. Structural issues remain. Leah, from your experience, do victims then and now get different levels of care based on their social status?
Yes, and that's the tragedy that repeats. Sex workers often don't report violence because they fear arrest, they fear shame, or they fear not being believed. When they do report, police attitudes can be dismissive. It's improving in some places, specialist units, diversion programs, better training, but we still have cases where the initial crucial hours are wasted because of bias. That makes cold cases more likely.
And before we move to suspect specifics, I want to bring in Frances Brown's connection to the Profumo affair. She testified during the Stephen Ward trial, which tied sex, politics, and the establishment into a messy public scandal. That connection led to wild speculation that a high-profile figure might be involved in the killings, but we have to be careful. Conspiracy fills gaps when evidence is missing.
Exactly. Conspiracies are emotionally satisfying. They let people imagine an enemy at the top, but they can distract from the structural failures, poverty, policing culture, misogyny, that actually produce the risk environment. You see the same pattern in modern cases. If there's a scandal adjacent to a murder, people will invent ties that don't exist rather than looking at the messy truths.
All right, let's go through the main suspects with concise appraisals. Kenneth Archibald, false confessor, acquitted. Mungo, Ireland, security guard with proximity to Heron Estate. Suicide, ambiguous alibi. Freddie Mills, sensational celebrity theory, limited evidence. The unnamed Met officer, alleged by some journalists and authors, plausible to the extent police collusion was possible in that era, but unproven. Harold Jones, the dark sun theory, tying an earlier convicted child murderer to similar MO and geographic presence in West London. Leah, which of these weighs heaviest for you?
I'm cautious. Harold Jones is interesting because he had a history of lethal violence and ended up in the right place at the right time. But narrative allure doesn't equal proof. Mungo Island's proximity to the Heron Estate and paint links are more forensic in appearance, but we lack conclusive ties. My broader stance is we should stop chasing celebrities and focus on the credible leads we can verify with records and eyewitness accounts. We should also look at patterns of institutional blind spots that made these women vulnerable.
I agree. And one more thing. The press's role. Tabloids ran with Jack the Stripper, Jack the Ripper's ghost revived because it sells. That framing encourages lurid fascination and erases nuance. It also puts a mantle of myth over very real human tragedies. The nickname helped the story live in the public imagination, but at what cost?
At the cost of empathy. I've spoken to women who told me they'd read those old headlines and felt the same erasure, reduced to a body and a sensational headline. That's why we foreground names tonight.
Let's go back briefly to the investigative turning points. The paint flakes traced to the Heron trading estate are one. Witnesses heard reversing cars near Mary Fleming's body, another. Frances Brown was last seen getting into a grey Ford Zephyr, an identikit emerged of the driver. And the idea of bodies being stored in a warm location before dumping, Bridget O'Hara's body showed signs of having been kept somewhere warm, suggests a place like a storage shed or workshop where a worker could store a body temporarily. That's chilling because it narrows the suspect universe to those with access to such spaces.
Yes, and the idea of storing a body in a warm place might indicate someone with local knowledge of how to keep a body from cooling quickly, maybe a worker with inside access, or maybe just someone who used a garage frequently. It's practical behavior that helps profile, but again, the evidence trail is thin.
We should talk about why the case remains unsolved. The easy list is lost or destroyed forensic material, dead witnesses, poor records, and possible institutional concealment. Without DNA or preserved items, modern investigators are limited. Geographic profiling and behavioral analysis can suggest likely candidates, but they cannot convict. Without DNA or preserved items, modern investigators are limited. Geographic profiling and behavioral analysis can suggest likely candidates, but they cannot convict.
And beyond technical limits, there's the social cost. Families, often estranged or marginalised, don't always have the resources to push for cold case reviews. Public appetite for reopening files depends on narrative traction. Cases that have celebrity hooks or scandal tend to get more airtime. Others die quietly. That's morally skewed.
Let's take a moment to imagine alternative outcomes. If Duros had treated the early murders as potentially linked and protected scenes, if paint flecks had been logged, if records had been kept intact, what might have been different?
Maybe a suspect would have been identified. Maybe DNA would have been recoverable. Maybe other crimes would have been prevented. But that's counterfactual. The more practical thing is to ask, what can we learn now? Policy reforms around evidence handling, better liaison with sex worker communities, diversion from criminalisation, those steps reduce harm and help policing.
As we near the end of the hour, I want to talk about legacy. Why does this case keep returning to public attention? Partly because it's unresolved, a human obsessives problem. But more importantly, it highlights how societies value certain lives. When murders of marginalised women go unsolved, it's not just about one killer, it's about structural disregard.
Right. And the lesson for activists and policymakers is clear. We need to take violence against sex workers seriously, not as a moral failing, but as a public safety issue. Outreach, non-judgmental services, and relationships with police that are built on trust, not criminalisation, save lives. We see that in cities that have harm reduction approaches.
Before we close, I want to read, slowly, the names of the women we covered tonight. Elizabeth Liz Figg, Gwyneth Rees, Hannah Tailford, Irene Lockwood, Helen Barthélemy, Mary Fleming, Frances Brown, Bridget Bridie O'Hara. They are more than headlines. They were people whose deaths exposed gaps in policing, in public sympathy, and in how a society protects its most vulnerable.
And we should remember the living families and friends who never got answers. When I do outreach, I meet people whose loved ones disappeared in ways that were minimised. Those families carry unanswered questions for decades. That's a kind of ongoing violence we don't often count.
So what can listeners take away? 1. Cold cases remain important, not just for the forensic puzzle, but for the dignity of victims. 2. Sensational theories, celebrity or conspiratorial, shouldn't crowd out careful, victim-centred inquiry. And 3. Structural reforms, improved evidence handling, better engagement with marginalised communities, and police accountability are vital to prevent future tragedies.
If you care about real change, support organisations that do outreach, donate to cold case charities that prioritise victims, and push your local police to develop trust with communities. And when you read sensational headlines, ask, who are they erasing?
We close with one final image. Imagine the river at dawn, quiet but for a rower's stroke. Imagine the city before the headlines arrive. Imagine someone finding a body and saying aloud a name, not Nude corpse, but Hannah Tailford. Imagine people who remember. That is the kind of remembering that resists myth.
Remember the names. Listen to the lives behind them. Thank you for doing that work, Eleanor.
Thank you, Leah. If you'd like to read more, we'll include a show note with the documentary Dark Sun, Neil Milkin's work, Dick Kirby's book, and some local archives. We'll also link to organisations that support sex worker safety and cold case advocacy. This is Still Unanswered. I'm Dr. Eleanor Marsh. If you have memories, documents or perspectives about these cases, photos, letters, local knowledge, reach out. Not because we chase headlines, but because every piece of information could matter, even decades later, and because these women deserve to be named.
Good night, and be careful out there.